Hello, everybody. Hope you're having a good lunch. Thank you all for coming. We're delighted to see such a nice, large, and lively crowd. I'm Terry McCarthy. I run the LA World Affairs Council. We're delighted to have our lunchtime keynote with Dominic Ng, who is, as you know, Chairman and CEO of East West Bank, and who are major sponsors for this conference, for which we're very grateful. Thank you so much for that. As I've explained to Dominic, when I took over the World Affairs Council, I felt that it needed to find a focus that was relevant to Los Angeles. You know, we have a lot of news from the Middle East and so on and so forth. It doesn't really so much impact what we do here in LA, but Los Angeles County has the single largest number of Asians in this country. 1.4 million Asians call LA County their home, which is bigger than any other county in the US. And so it seems an obvious theme for us to look at. And so we've increased our programming on Asia throughout the year. And then we had this really smart idea to have this conference, which we started last year, and we're building it this year. So I thought that was pretty smart. If I'd been really smart, I would have built up a bank that focused on Asia, and I would have had $36 billion in assets, which is exactly what Dominic has done. He's been at this for a little bit longer. 1991, he went to East West and has built it up from, I think it was 600 million or something then, to $36 billion. It's now the biggest bank in the United States with a focus on the China market. I think you're now the biggest independent bank based in LA, now that City National has got us link up with Canada. So this is an extraordinary success story. And it's a testimony, really, I think, to what we all know, which is Asia is really, really important. We've had some scary panels since last night and this morning. We looked at the security issues, particularly with North Korea, but this is not the main Asia story. And frankly, the fact that Kim Jong-un dominates the headlines is a little bit silly. It's a small little country, 20 million people. The future of Asia is where the future of the world is going. That's quite clear. And the United States, it behoves the US to hitch itself to that enormous movement that's moving through Asia. So Dominic, let's start out, if I may, with US-China, broadly. I am actually quite confused. Dominic Trump spent a lot of the campaign bashing China, and now he's going to China because he needs China's help. Steve Bannon, only last week, said we're in a trade war with China, and the rise of China is like the rise of the Nazis. And yet last weekend, the same Steve Bannon went to Hong Kong and said, I really admire China's economy, and by the way, Xi Jinping is the leader in the world that Donald Trump admires the most. So this messaging is leaving me somewhat confused. Can you tell us, where are we with US-China?
Well, I think in terms of, from our president, I think when Trump speaks, you know, he always have a lot of superlatives and hyperbole. So my view is that we just have to adjust to his style. In fact, oftentimes people always think that when an entertainer, you know, convert to a politician, you know, like Arnold doesn't say, you know, or actually even Arnold say, I'll be back, you know. So to that extent, I would say that, you know, Trump like adjectives, you know, and I think the foreign diplomats and the various countries' leaders have pretty much adjust to the style. That after a couple of months, initially I think there were a lot more concern about, well, exactly what does he really mean? After a couple of months, you just dial down 2 notches, then you know exactly what it means. So if you look at it, is that he's been actually relatively consistent. I mean, during the campaign, he's focusing on the campaign, and there's a lot of rhetorics about bashing China because he thought that will be something that can get a lot of media attention. Not necessarily that actually the voters are all Chinese haters, but it's really the media. You know, how do you get media attention when you speak out loud against China? All the media get to you, you know, and then he got free advertising, you know. So I think from that standpoint, you know, that's for winning. And then later on, once he start governing and start, you know, administrating, it's a different dynamic. And then he's still going to be either can say, oh, this is outstanding, or this is terrible. But at the end of the day, if you look at what's been executed, I think it's relatively benign. I haven't seen anything the administration have done as of today, and it's been, by the way, 9 months now. So I haven't seen anything that's been done as of today that I would say that, wow, this is so dramatically different than what U.S. past regimes or compared with the other presidents in the past. I mean, everything is, I would say, still relatively benign. There's always going to be a lot of noises, volatility, but it's coming from mainly just, again, hyperbole. I haven't seen anything that really are terrible. And the other thing I looked at is that you look at the one person that people most fear about a U.S.-China basher is Peter Navarro, that professor from UC Irvine. Where's Peter Navarro? Ever since Trump have taken over the administration, Peter Navarro went in, get a title that really didn't have any staff, and next thing happened is like Waddle. I mean, you can find Waddle easier than you can find Peter Navarro. It's like completely silent. So I looked at it and said, it's not that bad.
So look for those red and white scarves in the Oval Office pictures. That's Waldo, Peter, somewhere behind a curtain. Dominic, before we get into the nitty-gritty of U.S.-China trade and economic relations, just tell us a little bit about yourself. Born in Hong Kong. Why did you come here? Why did you stay? What's your personal story to where you are today?
Oh, it's a very typical story. Was born and raised in Hong Kong, came to U.S. for college education simply because, at that time, I left Hong Kong in 1977, so 20 years before mainland China taking over Hong Kong. So everybody from Hong Kong leaving for U.S., Canada, and Australia. So I got a job offer from the accounting firm Touche Ross, who offered me a green card package. So as long as I work hard, So I worked for Touche Ross for many years, and then they transferred me from Houston to LA, and that's where I am.
So you're part of this great wave of China involvement in the United States. China has benefited a lot from its relationship with the U.S. In 1980, when Deng Xiaoping really started to work at the economy, I think the GDP per capita was something like $300 per capita. It's now $8,000. The growth in China's economy is extraordinary. They've achieved a lot of that with smart economic policies, quite clearly, a lot of foreign investment, and a lot of exports. That has reached a point, for some years now, it has been quite controversial in the United States. China's persistent trade surpluses with the US. Talk to us a little bit about the trade surplus, and talk to us a little bit about how those figures are calculated, because I know you have a view on that.
Yeah, in fact, I wrote a few articles about the trade deficit number that which U.S. Political leaders, in fact, the media also, and then has been highlighting for the last many years about the biggest challenge between U.S. and China has been the massive trade deficit, which, by the way, last year was like $309 billion. The fact is, those numbers are grossly inaccurate. What happened is that U.S. have used a data collection and methodology from 1948 and never updated it. So I give you a very simple example is that if you look at your Apple iPhone, many of the components within the Apple iPhones are parts from, first of all, research development from US, and then a lot of the parts are made in Korea, they're made in Taiwan, and they're made in Germany, etc. So the parts are actually from China, and the labor costs from China for the entire iPhone is only 5%. So if you say that it costs about $250 to make the iPhone, 5% of that total cost is attributed by the Chinese labor. But because China is the last stop, because all the components have to go to Foxconn in the Guangdong province in China for the final assembly line to put it all together. So when it's shipped to US, this entire $250 will be counted as the sort of export from China to US. And so that's the deficit. And that's, if I always look at it is that this type of accounting, for me, running as a CEO of a publicly traded company, if I use this kind of accounting to report my bank's financials, I would be put into jail a long time ago. I mean, there's SEC have sanctioned, crawback for bonuses, all kinds of stuff. There'll be all kind of nasty things that can happen to any company. But it's amazing that we see that the U.S. government agency would continue to have data that are completely wrong. I mean, that's just one example. The second, I will give you another quick example, which is we're not counting service trade. We only count these manufacturing goods trade. So if U.S. Boeing send a plane to China, that counts as our export. Chinese send a bunch of garment merchandise to Walmart, that also count a trade. But what about U.S. export a lot of professional services, the lawyers? We have so many lawyers that can basically
not enough.
Can fill the whole country. But we have all of those services that we provide. And then the Chinese come to U.S. for education. U.S. have the best universities in the world. There are hundreds of thousands of Chinese in the United States studying in U.S. colleges. And the tourists, we all know, from Nordstrom to South Coast Plaza, or even Yellowstone National Park, are loaded with Chinese tourists with a flag. So again, I looked at it is that, but we're not counting any of that. When you look at U.S. are not manufacturing that many things, but we are great in services, but we're not counting it, it doesn't make any sense. So you look at it not correctly counting the components, not counting a specific type of services, and all of those, I think, cause the numbers to be so grossly inaccurately put together. It's hard to motivate the counterparty to do a fair trade negotiation when they say that, you start with the wrong number. You say that 1 + 1 = 5, and I know it's right. So let's start with that. And then the other party knows it's wrong and is not going to be very willing to negotiate. I think that there's one fundamental problem that needs to be fixed, and it's very easy to fix because these are numbers that are very easy for us to recalculate and get it right. And that's why I'm continuing to encourage, that the administration do something about it.
Okay, fair point, but you worked at Tushaus, you have a smart accounting mind, I don't. But this is not just an accounting error. There is a persistent deficit, it may not be as big as it's stated. How can we bring that down? Because it is a continual source of friction here in the United States. What measures can we take to?
Yeah, well, I think, so that's my view is that first you take out these misstatement stuff so that both parties now feel like it's fair. So if you, from the $309 billion, you knocked off about $160 billion or so of these, from iPhone to service trade area that is not being properly accounted for, then now you start with a much more meaningful numbers to work with. Let's just say that hypothetically, it's like $150 billion instead of $300 billion. Now you have something that's easier to work with. And I think there's a lot of opportunities to work on many different areas. One, I think that without a doubt, I think that U.S., if we look at, some of these, again, government policy, we have a lot of restriction of not allowing certain type of products, and many of them are technology related, to be exported to China. This even include, like aircraft toilet. Now how much of a national security to sell toilet to China? But what happened was because some of these policy were put together again in the 70s and has not been vigorously updated. So if we just go in and start looking into these policies aggressively, spend 2 to 3 months, and look at it hard and start looking at our allies and say, hey, the French are selling these exact same product to the Chinese, and the German are doing the same thing, or the Australian are doing the same thing, the Canadian doing the same thing. Why the US restrict our US companies and not allowing them to sell the same product to China? Those are things that if we just fix that, we can actually have a substantial amount of opportunities there. I mean, Wang Yang, the sort of a negotiation chief from China, for the last few years, been talking to the U.S. senior officials in terms of how we can solve the U.S.-China trade deficit challenge. He said that we import $220 billion of semiconductor chips. Import, not that they got it, they manufacture on their own, they import. So they're coming from all these different countries in Europe, in Asia, like Japan. He said, well, there's only 4% came from the United States. So it's only about 8 to 9 billion came from US. He said, well, I could have bought most of them from US because you guys have it. But if you restrict your company of selling to us, there's not much we can do. So I think that's one area I think US can do easily. The other area that I would say that is that in China, there are a lot of things that the Chinese can do. For example, like they have already done that. Like just recently, they allowed the import of beef, rice, so bioengineered soybean. There are things that, which is really somewhat benign. There's no reason for the Chinese to not allow US to export to China. And I looked at it as that the Chinese need to be more aggressive to open up that kind of opportunities for US. And the other thing is that maybe put down a lot more barriers, such as currently a lot of the companies are not allowed to invest more than 50% on certain industries. If the Chinese reduce these barriers, obviously that would help US to be able to have substantial more inroad and then be able to do more business in China. So it's just like on both sides, I need to figure out some low-hanging fruits and get the numbers down.
So do you think there's a willingness there in Beijing to make these concessions? Because the AmCham, they survey their members in China and they say increasingly they feel they're being pushed out of the Chinese markets. Is the Chinese government prepared to reverse some of those exclusions?
Actually, the Chinese government has to continue to go through these structural reforms, which require them to open up the market, because it's the only way for the business to continue to thrive, to grow. If they don't go through the reform, eventually, they get stifled, and then it's not going to be able to help them to grow. So I think the Chinese government is keenly aware of that. But they just want to do it at their own pace. They do not want to have US to dictate the Chinese economy. Because of pride. Of course, there's an element of pride into it, but it has to do with because I witnessed what happened with most of the countries in Asia during 1997. If you recall, 1997 was the major financial crisis in Asia. Countries like Korea, Indonesia, Thailand, Philippines, Singapore, Malaysia, they got hit really hard. The economy just went down by more than 50%. What happened? Because every one of them followed US lecture, like doing exactly what IMF or the World Bank taught them to do. And because of what they did, and gone too far in terms of sort of like creating their free market. And so the minute, some of these hedge funds start bailing out, the market crash, and then it caused them major damage. Now, during that time, there's only a few countries went unscathed, and one of them was China, because China controlled the currency, controlled the stock market. So there's not much for anybody to sort of attack that market. And then because of that, actually, it helped China to have much stronger prosperity in the next 2 decades. So I think they are going to continue to want to be sort of prudent, But they do need to have reforms. Now, if we go back to the American business, certain businesses are dealing with some challenges, such as the Chinese government are a lot more aggressive in the cybersecurity law because they always wanted to make sure that they know exactly what's going on in the other country. So that would affect, sometimes, the privacy or, the infringement of the IP and so forth. And that is a big challenge that the US and China need to figure out how to deal with it. But if I look at, again, statistics, the last 6 months, US business actually are making record earnings in China. So you look at General Motors, they're selling a lot of cars. The business still actually doing pretty good. Because it's very simple in the US is that if many of these big conglomerates, if the business don't do well, they'll close the business down. The fact is business is great. They just want more, which is, nothing wrong with it. So I do feel that, the Chinese government need to continue to do some reforms, which is not just helping US business to make more money, but also is actually beneficial to their continued growth in the future.
You've written a lot about this, and in fact, you might have found there's a brochure or a pamphlet on all your places with some of your thoughts on this. Intellectual property has been a continual issue between China and the United States. We had a discussion earlier today with Sanford Panich, who's the president of Columbia Pictures, and for various reasons, their big Spider-Man movie was delayed, released in China. It came out 5 months after it was released in the United States. And there was great anxiety there that would open a window for piracy, because when Chinese who can read everything, they see, oh, well, it's doing well in the United States and everyone's watching it in Japan and so on, so a big hit. They were afraid that it was going to be hugely pirated. It opened last weekend, $70 million over the weekend, one of the biggest ever openings. Turns out piracy is actually not as much an issue as it was. What's happening with intellectual property in China in terms of enforcement? Because as I said, it has been a huge issue for the United States.
It's definitely a big problem. I think that it is right now, if you look at the most critical subject that from the US-China bilateral relationship is really the intellectual property rights. I am very confident this issue will be resolved pretty expeditiously in the next 2 or 3 years. The reason is not because President Trump is a better negotiator. He's better negotiator on many other things, but not on this one. I think on this specific subject, it has to do with because the Chinese business in China are generating enormous number of patents, copyrights, and they have a larger VC population than United States. They are investing substantial amount of money into innovations. And because of that, company like Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, or smartphone company like Huawei, Xiaomi, or some of these other very, very smart, technologically focused type of business are now generating many different intellectual property rights in China. They are concerned about threats just like the US business. Used to be just the Intel and Cisco worry about this, but now it's the Chinese business who worry about it. So the Chinese government already have put into new court legislation and then the legal system to deal with this, and they will be even more aggressive because now they need to protect their own. And I do feel that this is something that, because of what's happening in China, naturally, they will find a way to take care of it. And in terms of, I think your example about Spider-Man is really a classic example. How is it possible for a movie that has been released in the United States several months ago that actually came out #1 in the box office ticket sales in China last weekend? Because you would expect that it had been private. Everybody already have the DVD, They don't. I give you my personal experience, because you asked me about where I came from. I came from Hong Kong. It wasn't China. It was a British colony when I was born and grew up. While I was living in Hong Kong, the governors from UK, our court system is the British law. All the judges are from UK. The police chief is from UK. But despite an entire British, like a British-run kind of like a government system, I remember in the late 60s, when I was a kid, trying to find a Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band album that are original is impossible. Everything's private. All the vinyl we have in Hong Kong is all private. Because at that time, people in Hong Kong couldn't afford to pay the kind of money to buy the original album. Everything is private. I mean, it's a supply-demand issue. Because of the supply-demand issue, it created the market as it was. So 10 years later, I would go back, I remember, in the early 80s, I would go back to Hong Kong and talk to my friends and say, they have these, I got my Billy Joel Stranger album, like everybody's original. Fleetwood Mac, Hotel California, all these albums, all original, because they have the money. And nobody's won anything less than that. And today, Chinese would go to the movie theater paying $9, $10 a ticket. Why would they go back and watch a private movies when someone just like do it, with a video camera and then it's shaking like that? Nobody's going to do that. They say, I'm not going to watch a movie like this. So it is what it is. So I think a lot of things that we worry about eventually, as long as China continue to have a high growing economy, you keep in mind, the GDP have grown tremendously from $300, as you said, to 8,000. US is 56, 57,000. So it's still far behind the United States. But you give them several more years to get to $20,000, $30,000, there's no such thing that we need to worry.
So we can talk about Hong Kong, where you came from. If you go to Hong Kong, there are a bunch of economists, and they all fall into one of two camps on China. You cannot be agnostic in Hong Kong. You're either a bull or you're a bear. And it's a full-time occupation, and they look at every single figure that comes out, and some come to one conclusion, some come to the other. The bears in Hong Kong all point to China's banks, enormous debts, and they say, told you, it's really going to crash now. And they've been saying this for some years, but who knows? They point at these bad debts, and that the government keeps somehow recycling them, but at some point it's going to come home to roost. You're a banker, you've seen the figures. Where is China's banking system? Where is it going? Is there a crash possible, or are they going to pull through?
My view is that, yes, China has, the banks have a lot of problem loans, and then quite a few of them actually is kind of like, at this point, it's kind of hidden. It's not as transparent like in the United States. But I absolutely do not believe there will be a crash in the banking system in China similar to what happened in the United States in 2008. Why? Because mainly is China has a very different political system. It all get back down to the political system. US, if I go back to 2008, well, first it's like excessive, behavior, maybe from early 2000 to 2007, subprime mortgages, CDOs, and all of those stuff that you heard it from all these different movies, or Wall Street Journal. When that happened, say someone like John Paulson and somebody similar will come in and start shorting the stock. And a few of those that may be somewhat egregious investors who are doing the shorting will start tipping Wall Street Journal and New York Times on Bloomberg and say, hey, you know what? That Lehman is going to fail. Merrill Lynch is going to fail, et cetera, that kind of stuff. They're going to start saying these kind of nasty things, which, quite frankly, yes, every banks have problem, but it wasn't that bad. But when the rumors are coming in, all these different news, CNBC, they all start talking it up. Front page, big problem. And now the regulators notice it. They got really worried. So they said, I'm not going to be falling behind. Let me go beat up somebody. So they start asking everybody to write down the asset. So now the accounting firms panic, They said, whoa, we weren't doing a very good job. Let's make sure, go in there, make sure they write everything down to market. There was no market because everybody panicked. When everybody panicked, there's no market. So what do? Well, no market, then you write down to zero. Eventually, you have properties that worth, let's say, $300,000 in, let's say, San Bernardino is now worth only about $100,000. How did that happen in like a 12-month span? The market would just went through this kind of spiral. Well, it's all of those elements. But then you look at China. China banks have problems for many, many years. In fact, they never once not have problems. They always have problems. But again, you have a control economy, and you have a one-party system. So when you have these bad loans that the Chinese banks have made to real estate developers that are speculative, that you heard about this ghost town, that buildings that completed, nobody's staying there, etc. It's true. So they have major problems on their balance sheet, in the portfolio. But instead of, and they have short sellers going out there and spreading rumors. Now, they couldn't do it in the state media for the newspaper. They could do it on WeChat or internet, Once they spread these bad rumors, and market crash. It happened in 2015. You saw that in 2015, suddenly the Shanghai Stock Exchange dropped like 50, 60%. So now the difference is that instead of like after it dropped, and the government said that, well, U.S. will be in a position, the DOJ would say that, well, we may start an investigation, which may take 3 years. SEC may take 2 years, right? But in China, they start visiting whoever who spread the rumors and start knocking on doors, have a cup of tea with them, say, what are you going to do? Cease and desist, right? And then it all stopped. And then they would go into some of these major fund managers, say, you know what? For the sake of the country, don't sell, right? Let's do what's right for the good of the country. Don't sell. And then they tell all these other publicly traded companies that stop trading for a while. We can do whatever we want. Now, it sounds terrible from a U.S. perspective. It said, wow, this is not free market. This is terrible. But you know what? 1.5 years later, everything's fine. I tell you, these banks have a lot of problem loans. They have these shadow banking problems, but they're fixing it. The government knows the problem. They're fixing it, but they're fixing it in a very deliberate or concerted effort. They can control the media to not get out of control and then spreading rumors that would hurt the economy. They also can go to the accounting firms. They can go to the banking regulator and say, stop doing these nonsense. We can't do anything. See, the United States is such a free country. We can't do anything. So, that's what I looked at. Is that likelihood that we have a financial crisis in the future in the United States? Yeah, very possible, because we have a system that guarantee that would happen. But in China, as long as you have, the current regime doing what they're doing, these type of things can always be mitigated. It sounds totally counterintuitive, because you would think that, what the system over there, is the lack of individual rights and then lack of democracy is just horrible. Well, I totally agree with all of that kind of thoughts from a different kind of perspective. But when you talk about controlling, managing a banking system, there's nothing better than that.
Bracing views. But let me ask you this. So, as anyone who's been to China recently knows, China sort of leapfrog credit cards, and they're actually ahead of the United States in terms of mobile payments. You go to a restaurant or a store now, you just take out your smartphone, WeChat, it's done. FinTech. Tell me what East West Bank looks like in 10 years' time. And I'm cognizant of the fact that many of your colleagues are sitting around here. Are they still going to have a job? Where is your bank going to be in 10 years' time, and what will your business look like, given how fintech is increasing, online banking and so on and so forth? What's it going to look like in 10 years' time?
Well, first of all,
no offense.
First of all, I hope I'm not going to be here because I've been here too long. I think that would be a great success if 10 years from now you don't see me. Secondly, I think that East-West is going to look more or less the same because we have a very clear, 26 years ago when I set the agenda about what East-West vision is, I said that we're going to be the financial bridge between the East and the West. And we stay true to our objective, our principle, and so far so good. And I don't see why we wouldn't do that 10 years from now. So it will only be, we're going to be much, I would say, bigger than where we are today. We're going to offer more products, better services to our clients. We're going to have a lot more business. And obviously the economy will be different, and then lifestyle is different, demographics different. But East-West most likely is going to keep doing whatever doing. My colleagues here is going to carry the torch and continue to do what we've been doing for the last 20-some odd years that I've been doing it.
You guys are all good. Dominic, thank you so much. This is an ongoing conversation. The US-China conversation will go on for a long, long time, and appreciate your part of it. And thank you for your support for the conference. Thank you all for coming.